guys, I'm Mai-linh Dovan, certified athletic therapist and founder of Rehab-U Movement and Performance Therapy. Welcome to our YouTube channel. This week we're going to talk about the 5 most common squat coaching mistakes. Before I get into that, it has been a while since I put out some new content for you guys. I'm still around. I actually recently celebrated 30 years of training. I've just been busy traveling all around the world, teaching courses to trainers and therapists in French, in English. So that's what I've been doing. If you're new here and you don't know Rehab-U, we do continuing education courses for trainers and therapists on the very great topic of rehab is training. Now, that said, let's get back to it because there's so much I want to share with you guys today. Now, the 5 most common cues I hear with the squat are: number 1, hips back first; number 2, weight on your heels; number 3, knees shouldn't come forward; number 4, torso and shins should be parallel; number 5, keep your torso upright or extend your lower back or bring your chest up. Hey guys, thanks for watching our videos, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. These cues aren't inherently wrong, but they can go wrong. As you may have heard me say before, a cue only reminds, it doesn't teach. There are reasons why these cues have become so common. It was because they were used to fix very common mistakes. However, if we start using them globally for everyone, we're creating responses that we're not necessarily looking for. It could be the right cue for one person and the very wrong cue for another person. And I think in order for you guys to understand how these cues can be misleading, how these cues can be wrong for certain people, you need to have a great grasp on how the squat actually works. So we're going to go into what's the intention behind these cues, what they might do that you would want as a response, and what they might do that you wouldn't be looking for as a response. And we're going to do that using the squat, understanding how the squat works, understanding how individual proportions impact the squat, so that you can clearly understand when's going to be a good time to say hips should move back, when is not going to be a good time, or if we should use those cues at all. All right, so to get started, we're going to bring our model in. Now, no, it's not Joey. A lot of you guys have been asking me, a lot of people write to me to ask me where Joey is. He couldn't be here today. He says hello. But don't worry, I'm with Pierre-Luc, and you will also absolutely love him. Pierre-Luc is a kinesiologist. He's a very important collaborator at Rehab-U for everything training and periodization. That's really his specialty. So he's here with us today so we can go through these squat coaching mistakes, and he's going to be our supermodel. We're going to go through each of the little common mistakes that I mentioned earlier and talk about maybe why we're using these cues, what the intention is, but why they can go wrong. So we're going to use the dowel across Pierre-Luc's back just so that he's not constantly having a barbell across his back for the next 10 minutes. So we're going to go ahead and put his dowel in the position that he would use for a squat. He's only using a dowel here, right? So it's not a lot of weight. But understand that when you have a barbell across your back like this with weight, it changes your center of gravity. So automatically when you have a heavy barbell across your back, as you can see, he's a little bit angled forward. And that's normal because he's got to shift his center of gravity to maintain his balance, to maintain stability. Okay, so the most important thing with a squat is a vertical bar path. So what happens if we tell Pierre-Luc to shoot his hips back first? So no knees, just hips. What's going to happen? See how that barbell is traveling forward. So if we use hips back first, that's going to change his center of gravity. It's going to change everything about the load that he can handle here. Come on back up. Now, why are we using this cue? We're using the cue hips back first because a lot of people who are just starting to squat will naturally dive into their knees, right? So there we go. So a lot of people are actually going to go knees first and weight towards the forefoot. We call it a forefoot squatter. And again, what happens if you look at the barbell, if I go into my toes first, it's also traveling on this diagonal line, right? So that's when we started using this cue hips back first. In reality, it's actually supposed to be knees and hips unlock at the same time so that he can maintain a very vertical bar path. So he's going to unlock both the hips and the knees at the same time to squat. It's not hips back first or knees first. It's kind of both at the same time. Second common cue is, and it's a little bit similar to hips back first, it's weight on your heels. Again, this cue comes from those people who are forefoot squatters who will automatically dive into the forefoot, knees first, and the heels will lift up off the ground. So when someone does this, automatically the cue is, okay, let's get your weight, put your weight on your heels, right? And so we understand where that's coming from. I'm taking that exaggerated mistake and I'm sending the person the opposite direction. But what happens when we start using that cue with everyone is that if he puts all his weight on his heels, again, it's going to become a much more hip dominant squat. And then sometimes the toes are actually going to come up and you're going to lose stability on the ground. So see how now his weight is on his heels, but he's not grounded into the floor. You actually want the weight on the whole foot, the tripod of the foot, so big toe, little toe, and heel, and you want your weight in the middle of that triangle. Again, because the barbell has to travel in a vertical bar path over the midfoot. So he's going to keep his weight distributed on his feet so that his barbell can travel over the midfoot. He's neither hips first, neither knees first. He's neither weight on the toes, weight on the heels. It's all very distributed. And again, we'll get into a little bit later how his proportions are going to change that as well. His individual proportions are going to change. How much is he in his hips? How much is he in his knees? How forward is he? How upright is he? Number 3, the common myth that the knees should not come forward past the toes. Now, again, bar path on a squat should be vertical. And just before I was telling you guys that proportions are going to change. How much of that is the knees breaking? How much of that is the hips breaking? But from the top of the squat, the knees and the hips break simultaneously to come down and maintain a vertical bar path. People with different proportions are going to have more or less knees and hips. Someone, for example, who has very long tibias, shorter femurs, longer torso, good proportions for squatting, may have more knee moment, okay? So their knees are going to come forward a little bit. It's not going to be so much the case for Pierre-Luc because he's more of a low bar kind of back squatter. He's more of a hip dominant squatter. But someone who's got longer tibias may have the knees that come forward quite a bit. And the knees coming past the toes is fine. The reason why we started to say, you can come back up for a second. The reason why we started to say, don't let the knees come forward over the toes is the same reason that we started to tell people to put the weight on their heels, is that if my knees come over my toes, but my heels are lifting off the ground, that's when I'm getting a lot of forces on the knees, and I'm also having a bar path now that's diagonal again. It's no longer vertical. But if my feet are well grounded, my knees, it's okay for my knees to come forward past my toes. So the difference there is the bar path vertical? Next common cue that I hear is, as far as positioning, is your shins and your torso should be parallel at the bottom of the squat. Now again, that's going to depend on proportions. It's also going to depend on the type of squat. Perhaps a lot of people kind of have a hybrid squat that's somewhere between a low bar back squat and a high bar back squat, and maybe a lot of people are more or less parallel as far as the shins and torso are concerned at the bottom of the squat. Again, that depends a lot on proportions, and if you're doing a low bar back squat, which is a more hip dominant squat, the more your hips shift back, the more the torso has to come forward. So if we get Pierre-Luc to do like a low bar back squat, it's going to be automatically more hip dominant, and as you can see, he's going to have a forward torso lean much more than the angle of his shins. So his shins and his torso are not perpendicular. Come back up and do another rep. And if that bar is traveling on a vertical bar path over the midfoot, then that's okay. So you can come back up. So saying that the shins and the torso have to be perpendicular at the bottom of the squat is simply not going to fit for everyone. And it's probably not going to fit if I'm working with a low bar back squatter. The other thing that will come into play is if Pierre-Luc doesn't have good dorsiflexion, he's automatically going to default to a more hip-dominant squat, because what happens when you don't have good dorsiflexion is your knees can't come forward so much, so your hips have to shoot back a little bit more, and if your hips shoot back a little bit more, your torso has to come forward more, again, to maintain that vertical bar path. Come on up. So I know you're hearing me harp about vertical bar path, vertical bar path, vertical bar path, and that's the important thing with a barbell squat or with most barbell lifts, right? The best way to move that barbell is on a vertical path because gravity is acting on it vertically, okay? So again, if the bar path is vertical, different people will have different amount of knees past dos, different amount of hips shifting back, and different amounts of torso lean. That's the important thing to remember here. Last common cue that I hear is torso upright, or lift the chest up, or extend your back, right? Now, I understand the intent here is that we don't want to flex under the load, right? But the problem is what we meant was maintain a rigid torso. But what we said was keep your torso upright. So if I have someone like Pierre-Luc, for example, who's a little bit more hip dominant in his squat, so his hips are going to shift back a little bit more. And what did I say earlier? When the hips shift a little bit more back, the torso has to come forward more, right? So he goes into his regular squat, torso forward. Now if here he understood, when I said torso upright, he understood try to stay vertical. His hips are shifting back, and he's trying to maintain his chest up and his torso vertical. So he's getting a lot of stress here versus we need that torso to come forward, all right? So the mistake here is that if I have someone who needs to have a forward torso, and I've told them chest up, then they're trying to do a low bar back squat or a hip dominant squat where the torso needs to come forward, but they're simultaneously trying to bring the chest up, or they've understood that their torso needs to be vertical. But now you understand when you think of vertical bar path that if my squat is hip dominant, my torso cannot be vertical. My torso is automatically going to have much more forward lean. And what's going to happen is people are going to get that pinch in their lower back. Again, it's important to have an arch in the lower back when you're doing the squat, in the sense that you want to maintain voluntary contraction of your lumbar extensors, but we don't want a hyperextended back either. So that cue, chest up or torso upright, could be wrong for someone like Pierre-Luc, and it could be wrong for someone who already tends to hyperextend that low back. That old gymnast that you have that's now come into CrossFit, and she's hyperextended in her lower back, right? So the chest up cue for that person is not going to be right as well. The torso upright, the extend your back. So it's really about keeping a rigid lever. That's what we meant when we used that cue, but that's where it can kind of go wrong. So to put this all together, remember that you want to look at each individual and their proportions, and also their comfort level as far as the squat. People will kind of automatically groove their own squat pattern, and if they have things like restricted ankle dorsiflexion, then there are things that you're going to see. That's the case a little bit with Pierre-Luc. He's a little bit restricted in his dorsiflexion, so he's automatically going to have a bit of a more hip dominant squat. It's also a squat that allows you to lift a lot more weight, right? The low bar back squat will allow you to lift a lot more than the front squat, for example. Now, a lot of people aren't going to have a pure low bar back squat. They're going to have not either a pure high bar back squat. They're going to have a bit of a hybrid between the two, which I think is a little bit Pierre-Luc's case. So remember what I was saying earlier is when you've got the weight on your shoulders, it changes where your center of gravity is. So he's automatically a little bit more forward. And when I say that his squat is more hip dominant, that doesn't mean that he shoots his hips back first. It means that the final result when he's at the bottom of his squat, he's going to go ahead, he's going to have more hips and more forward torso, a little bit less knees. But as you can see, he breaks at the hips and at the knees simultaneously. Good. And come on and rack the bar. So he had pretty good dorsiflexion there still. You can have people who are more hip dominant than that. And if he was more hip dominant, you would see torso lean even more, always to keep that bar over the midfoot. So guys, the main takeaways here are hips back first, weight on the heels, knees shouldn't come forward over the toes, shins and torso should be parallel, and torso upright. Those are cues that maybe you can use with certain people based on their different proportions, based on some restrictions that they may have, based on some movement habits that they have that you're trying to correct. But they're not cues that should be used globally, because the squat is very individual. It's going to change based on your ankle dorsiflexion, based on your proportions, based on whether you're a posterior chain dominant person or an anterior chain dominant person, based on the type of squat that you're doing. In any case, the most important thing to look at is vertical bar path. So based on understanding what this individual's restrictions are and which squat you're trying to do, you're going to have to look at the squat, look at vertical bar path, and figure out what are then going to be the best cues for that person if there are things to correct. Because remember, the cue doesn't teach, it only reminds. So it can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing. I think understanding everything that goes on in the squat is most important for you to understand when and why you're going to use a cue and what the squat should actually look like for this individual person, and assess that for each client or patient that you're working with. So guys, thanks for listening to this video, and stay tuned for our next one on YouTube, and don't forget to subscribe.